Hello, my friend. Welcome to the Sleepy Archive. I'm so glad you're here. How was your day today? Before your eyes get too heavy, a little like and subscribe goes a long way. Sweet dreams. Welcome to the Sleepy Archive, where the quiet voices of history drift gently into the night. Tonight we journey into the ancient world, a world of mysterious rites, forgotten wisdom, and the slow, patient unfolding of human thought across 13 centuries. This is a history of magic and experimental science by Lynn Thorndike. Let the words carry you gently into rest. Magic has existed among all peoples and at every period. Hegel. This book aims to treat the history of magic and experimental science and their relations to Christian thought during the first 13 centuries of our era, with a special emphasis upon the 12th and 13th centuries. No adequate survey of the history of either magic or experimental science exists for this period, and considerable use of manuscript material has been necessary for the medieval period. Magic is here understood in the broadest sense of the word, as including all occult arts and sciences, superstitions, and folklore. I shall endeavor to justify this use of the word from the sources as I proceed. My idea is that magic and experimental science have been connected in their development, that magicians were perhaps the first to experiment, and that the history of both magic and experimental science can be better understood by studying them together. I also desire to make clearer than it has been to most scholars the Latin learning of the medieval period, whose leading personalities even are generally inaccurately known. And on perhaps no one point is illumination more needed than on that covered by our investigation. The subject of laws against magic, popular practice of magic, the witchcraft delusion, and persecution lie outside of the scope of this book. At first my plan was to limit this investigation to the 12th and 13th centuries, the time of greatest medieval productivity. But I became convinced that this period could be best understood by viewing it in the setting of the Greek, Latin, and early Christian writers to whom it owed so much. If the student of the Byzantine Empire needs to know old Rome, the student of the medieval church to comprehend early Christianity, the student of Romance languages to understand Latin, still more must the reader of Constantinus Africanus, Vincent of Beauvais, Guido Bonatti, and Thomas Aquinas be familiar with the Pliny, Galen, and Ptolemy, the Origen and Augustine, the Al-Kindi and Albumacer from whom they drew. It would indeed be difficult to draw a line anywhere between them. The ancient authors are generally extant only in their medieval form. In some cases there is reason to suspect that they have undergone alteration or addition. Sometimes new works were fathered upon them. In any case, they have been preserved to us because the Middle Ages studied and cherished them, and to a great extent made them their own. I begin with the first century of our era, because Christian thought begins then, and then appeared Pliny's Natural History, which seems to me the best starting point of survey of ancient science and magic. Where tonight we turn to Pliny the Elder, a Roman of the first century who compiled 2,000 books into 37 and met his death sailing towards the eruption of Vesuvius to get a better look. He left behind a natural history that is either the greatest encyclopedia ever written or the most magnificent collection of nonsense in the ancient world. Very probably, it is both. Let us begin. We should have to search long before finding a better starting point for the consideration of the union of magic with the science of the Roman Empire, and of the way in which that union influenced the Middle Ages than Pliny's natural history. The foregoing sentence, with which years ago I opened a chapter on the natural history of Pliny the Elder in my briefer preliminary study of magic in the intellectual history of the Roman Empire, seems as true as ever, and although I there considered his confusion of magic and science at some length, I do not see how I can make the present work well-rounded and complete without including in it a yet more detailed analysis of the contents of Pliny's book, Pliny's Natural History, which appeared about 77 AD and is dedicated to the Emperor Titus, is perhaps the most important single source extant for the history of ancient civilization. Its 37 books, written in a very compact style, constitute a vast collection of the most miscellaneous information. Whether one is investigating ancient painting, sculpture, and other fine arts, or the geography of the Roman Empire, or Roman triumphs, gladiatorial contests, and theatrical exhibitions, or the industrial processes of antiquity, or Mediterranean trade, or Italian agriculture, or mining in ancient Spain, or the history of Roman coinage, or the fluctuation of prices in antiquity, or the Roman attitude towards usury, or the pagan attitude towards immortality, or the nature of ancient beverages, or the religious usages of the ancient Romans, or any of a number of other topics, one will find something concerning all of them in Pliny. He is apt both to depict such conditions in his own time and to trace them back to their origins. Furthermore, he repeats many detailed incidents of interest to the political or narrative historian of Rome, as well as to the student of the economic, social, artistic, and religious life of antiquity. Probably there is no place where an isolated point is more likely to be run down by the investigator, and it is regrettable that exhaustive analytical indices of the work are not available. We may add that, although the work is supposedly a collection of facts, Pliny contrives to introduce many moral reflections and sharp comments on the luxury, vice, and unintellectual character of his times, suggesting Juvenal's picture of degenerate Roman society and his own lofty moral standards. Indeed, Pliny's title, Naturalis Historia, or at least the common English translation of it, Natural History, has been criticized as too limited in scope, and the work has been described as rather a vast encyclopedia of ancient knowledge and belief upon almost every known subject. Pliny himself mentions in his preface the Greek word encyclopedia as indicative of his scope. Nevertheless, his work is primarily an account of nature rather than of civilization, and much of its information concerning such matters as the arts and business is incidental. Most of its books bear such titles as aquatic animals, exotic trees, medicines from forest trees, the natures of metals. After an introductory book containing the preface and a table of contents and lists of authorities for each of the subsequent books, the second book treats of the universe, heavenly bodies, meteorology, and the chief changes, such as earthquakes and tides, in the land and water forming the earth's surface. After 4 books devoted to geography, the 7th deals with man and human inventions. For more follow on terrestrial and aquatic animals, birds, and insects. 16 more are concerned with plants, trees, vines, and other vegetation, and the medicinal simples derived from them. 5 books discuss the medicinal simples derived from animals, including the human body. And the last 5 books treat of metals and minerals and the arts in which they are employed. It is thus evident that in the main Pliny is concerned with natural science, and that, if his work is a mine of miscellaneous historical information, it should even more prove a rich treasure house, quoniam, utiate demitius piso, thesauros opertet esse non libros, for an investigation concerned as intimately as is ours with the history of science. The natural history is a great storehouse of misinformation as well as of information. For Pliny's credulity and lack of discrimination harvested the tares of legend and magic along with the wheat of historical fact and ancient science in his voluminous granary. This may put other historical investigators upon their guard in accepting its statements, but only increases its value for our purpose. Perhaps it is even more valuable as a collection of ancient errors than it is as a repository of ancient science. It touches upon many of the varieties and illustrates most of the characteristics of magic. Moreover, Pliny often mentions the magi or magicians and discusses magic expressly at some length in the opening chapters of his 30th book. One of the most important passages on the theme in any ancient writer. Pliny the Elder, as we learn from his own statements in the natural history and from one or two letters concerning him written by his nephew, Pliny the Younger, whom he adopted, went through the usual military, forensic, and official career of the Roman of good family, and spent his life largely in the service of the emperors. He visited various Mediterranean lands, such as Spain, Africa, Greece, and Egypt, and fought in Germany. He was in charge of the Roman fleet on the west coast of Italy when he met his death at the age of 56 by suffocation as he was trying to rescue others from the fumes and vapors from the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. Of Pliny's writings, the natural history is alone extant, but other titles have been preserved which serve to show his great literary industry and the extent of his interests. He wrote on the use of the javelin by cavalry, a life of his friend Pomponius, an account in 20 books of all the wars waged by the Romans in Germany, a rather long work on oratory called The Student, a grammatical or philological work in 8 books entitled the Jubeo Sermon, and a continuation of the history of Aufidius Bassus in 31 books. Yet in the dedication of the natural history to the Emperor Titus, he states that his days were taken up with official business, and only his nights were free for literary labor. This statement is supported by a letter of his nephew telling how he used to study by candlelight both late at night and before daybreak. Pliny the Younger narrates several incidents to illustrate how jealous and economical of every spare moment his uncle was. He would dictate or have books read to him while lying down or in the bath, and on journeys his secretary was always by his side with books and tablets. If the weather was very cold, the amanuensis wore gloves so that his hands might not become too numb to write. Pliny always took notes on what he read, and at his death left his nephew 160 notebooks written in a small hand on both sides. Such were the conditions under which, and the methods by which, Pliny compiled his encyclopedia on nature. No single writer, either Greek or Latin, he tells us, had ever before attempted so extensive a task. He adds that he treats of some 20,000 topics gleaned from the perusal of about 2,000 volumes by 100 authors. Judging from his bibliographies and citations, however, he would seem to have utilized more than 100 authors. But possibly he had not read all the writers mentioned in his bibliographies. He affirms that previous students have had access to but few of the volumes which he has used, and that he adds many things unknown to his ancient authorities and recently discovered. Occasionally, he shows an acquaintance with beliefs and practices of the Gauls and Druids. Thus his work assumes to be something more than a compilation from other books. He says, however, that no doubt he has omitted much, since he is only human and has had many other demands upon his time. He admits that his subject is dry, sterilis materia, and does not lend itself to literary exhibitions, nor include matters stimulating to write about and pleasant to read about, like speeches and marvelous occurrences and varied incidents. Nor does it permit purity and elegance of diction, since one must at times employ the terminology of rustics, foreigners, and even barbarians. Furthermore, it is an arduous task to give novelty to what is ancient, authority to what is new, interest to what is obsolete, light to what is obscure, charm to what is loathsome, as many of his medicinal simples undoubtedly are credit to what is dubious. It is a great comfort to Pliny, however, in his immense task, when many laugh at him as wasting his time over worthless trifles, to reflect that he is being spurned along with nature. In another passage, he contrasts the blood and slaughter of military history with the benefits bestowed upon mankind by astronomers. In a third passage, he looks back regretfully at the widespread interest in science among the Greeks. Although those were times of political disunion and strife, and although communication between different lands was interrupted by piracy as well as war, whereas now, with the whole empire at peace, not only is no new scientific inquiry undertaken, but men do not even thoroughly study the works of the ancients, and are intent on the acquisition of lucre rather than learning. These and other passages which might be cited attest Pliny's devotion to science. In Pliny, we also detect signs of the conflict between science and religion. In a single chapter on God, he says pretty much all that the Church Fathers later repeated at much greater length against paganism and polytheism. But his discussion would hardly satisfy a Christian. He asserts that it is God for man to aid his fellow man, and this is the path to eternal glory. But he turns this noble sentiment to justify deification of the emperors who have done so much for mankind. He questions whether God is concerned with human affairs, slyly suggests that if so, God must be too busy to punish all crimes promptly, and points out that there are some things which God cannot do. He cannot commit suicide as men can, nor alter past events, nor make twice 10 anything else than 20. Pliny then concludes, by which is revealed in no uncertain wise the power of nature, and that is what we call God. In many other passages, he exclaims at nature's benignity or providence. He believed that the soul had no separate existence from the body, and that after death there was no more sense left in body or soul than was there before birth. The hope of personal immortality he scorned as puerile ravings produced by the fear of death, and he believed still less in the possibility of any resurrection of the body. In short, natural law, mechanical force, and facts capable of scientific investigation would seem to be all that he will admit and to suffice to satisfy his strong intellect. Yet we shall later find him having the greatest difficulty in distinguishing between science and magic, and giving credence to many details in science which seem to us quite as superstitious as the pagan beliefs concerning the gods which he rejected. But if any reader is inclined to belittle Pliny for this, let him first stop and think how Pliny would ridicule some modern scientists for their religious beliefs, or for their spiritualism or psychic research. It is desirable, however, to form some estimate of Pliny's fitness for his task, in order to judge how accurate a picture of ancient science his work is. He does not seem to have had much detailed training or experience in the natural sciences himself. He writes not as a naturalist who has observed widely and profoundly the phenomena and operations of nature, but as an omnivorous reader and voluminous note-taker who owes his knowledge largely to books or hearsay, although occasionally he says, "I know" instead of "they say," or gives the results of his own observation and experience. In the main, he is not a scientist himself, but only a historian of science or nature. After all, his title, Natural History, is a very fitting one. The question, of course, arises whether he has sufficient scientific training to evaluate properly the work of the past, Has he read the best authors? Has he noted their best passages? Has he understood their meaning? Does he repeat inferior theories and omit the corrective views of certain Alexandrian scientists? These questions are hard to answer. On his behalf, it may be said that he deals little with abstruse scientific theory and mainly with simple substances and geographical places, matters in which it seems difficult for him to go far astray. Scientific specialists were not numerous in those days, anyway, and science had not yet so far advanced and ramified that one man might not hope to cover the entire field and do it substantial justice. Pliny the Younger was perhaps a partial judge, but he described the natural history as a work remarkable for its comprehensiveness and erudition, and not less varied than nature herself. One thing in Pliny's favor as a compiler, besides his personal industry, unflagging interest, and apparently abundant supply of clerical assistance, is his full and honest statement of his authorities, although he adds that he has caught many authors transcribing others verbatim without acknowledgement. He has, however, great admiration for many of his authorities, exclaiming more than once at the care and diligence of the men of the past who have left nothing untried or unexperienced, from trackless mountain tops to the roots of herbs. Sometimes, nevertheless, he disputes their assertions. For instance, Hippocrates said that the appearance of jaundice on the 7th day in fever is a fatal sign, but we know some who have lived even after this. Pliny also scolds Sophocles for his falsehoods concerning amber. It may seem surprising that he should expect strict scientific truth from a dramatic poet, but Pliny, like many medieval writers, seems to regard poets as good scientific authorities. In another passage, he accepts Sophocles' statement that a certain plant is poisonous, rather than the contrary view of other writers, saying, "The authority of so prominent a man moves me against their opinions." He also cites Menander concerning fish and, like almost all the ancients, regards Homer as an authority on all matters. Pliny sometimes cites the works of King Juba of Numidia, than whom there hardly seems to have been a greater liar in antiquity. He stated, among other things, in a work which he wrote for Gaius Caesar, the son of Augustus, that a whale 600 feet long and 360 feet broad had entered a river in Arabia. But where should Pliny turn for sober truth? The Stoic Chrysippus prated of amulets. Treatises ascribed to the great philosophers Democritus and Pythagoras were full of magic. And in the works of Cicero, he read of a man who could see for a distance of 135 miles, and in Varro that this man, standing on a Sicilian promontory, could count the number of ships sailing out of the harbor of Carthage. The natural history has been criticized as poorly arranged and lacking in scientific classification. But this is a criticism which can be made of many works of the classical period. Their presentation is apt to be rambling and discursive rather than logical and systematic. Even Aristotle's History of Animals is described by Lewis as unclassified in its arrangement and careless in its selection of material. I have often thought that the scholastic centuries did mankind at least one service, that of teaching lecturers and writers how to arrange their material. Pliny seems rather in advance of his times in supplying full tables of contents for the busy emperor's convenience. Valerius Soranus seems to have been the only previous Roman writer to do this. One indication of haste in composition and failure to sift and compare his material is the fact that Pliny sometimes makes or includes contradictory statements, probably taken from different authorities. On the other hand, he not infrequently alludes to previous passages in his own work, thus showing that he has his material fairly well in hand. Pliny once said that there was no book so bad but what some good might be got from it, and to the modern reader he seems almost incredibly credulous and indiscriminate in his selection of material, and to lack any standard of judgment between the true and the false. Yet he often assumes an air of skepticism and censures others sharply for their credulity or exaggeration. "'Tis strange," he remarks apropos of some tales of men transformed into wolves for 9 or 10 years, "how far Greek credulity has gone. No lie is so impudent that it lacks a voucher." Once he expresses his determination to include only those points on which his authorities are in agreement. On the whole, while to us today the natural history seems a disorderly and indiscriminate conglomeration of fact and fiction, its defects are probably to a great extent those of its age and of the writers from whom it has borrowed. If it does not reflect the highest achievements and clearest thinking of the best scientists of antiquity, and be it said that there are a number of the Hellenistic age of whom we should know less than we do but for Pliny, it probably is a fairly faithful epitome of science and error concerning nature in his own time and the centuries preceding. At any rate, it is the best portrayal that has reached us. From it we can get our background of the confusion of magic and science in the Hellenistic age, and then reveal against this setting the development of them both in the course of the Roman Empire and Middle Ages. Pliny gives so many items upon each point, and is so much fuller than the average ancient or medieval book of science, that he serves as a reference book, being the likeliest place to look to find duplicated some statement concerning nature by a later writer. This of course shows that such a statement did not originate with a later writer, but is not a sure sign that he copied from Pliny. They may both have used the same authorities, as seems the case with Greek authors later in the Empire who probably did not know of Pliny's work. In the Middle Ages, however, Pliny had an undoubted direct influence. Manuscripts of the natural history are numerous, although in a scarcely legible condition owing to corrections and emendations which enhance the obscurity of the text and perhaps do Pliny grave injustice in other respects. Also, many manuscripts contain only a few books or fragments of the text, so that it is possible that many medieval scholars knew their Pliny only in part. This, however, can scarcely be argued from their failure to include more from him in their own works, for that might be due to their knowing the natural history so well that they took its contents for granted and tried to include other material in their own works. In a later chapter we shall treat of the medicine of Pliny, a treatise derived from the natural history. Pliny's phrase rerum natura figures as the title of several medieval encyclopedias of somewhat similar scope, and his own name was too well known in the Middle Ages to escape having a work on the philosopher's stone ascribed to him. That the natural history was well known as a whole at least by the close of the Middle Ages is shown by the numerous editions, some of them magnificently printed, which were turned off from the Italian presses immediately after the invention of printing. In the Magliabechian Library of Florence alone are editions printed at Venice in 1469 and 1472, at Rome in 1473 and Parma in 1481, again at Venice in 1487, 1491, and 1499, not to mention Italian translations which appeared at Venice in 1476 and 1489. These editions were accompanied by some published criticism of Pliny's statements, since in 1492 appeared at Ferrara a treatise on the errors of Pliny and others in medicine by Nicholas Leonicinus of Vicenza with a dedication to Politian. But 2 years later Pliny found a defender in Pandulph Collinutius. But Pliny's future influence will come out repeatedly in later chapters. We shall now inquire, first, what signs of experimental science he shows, either derived from the past or added by himself. Second, what he defines as magic and what he has to say about it. Third, how much of what he supposes to be natural science must we regard as essentially magic? It is probably only a coincidence that 2 medieval manuscripts close the natural history in the midst of the 76th chapter of the last book with the words, Experimenta pluribus modis constant, primum pondi. But although from the very nature of his work Pliny makes extensive use of authorities, he not infrequently manifests a realization, as one dealing with the facts of nature should, of the importance of observation and experience as means of reaching the truth. The claims of many Romans of high rank to have carried their arms as far as Mount Atlas, which Pliny declares has been repeatedly shown by experience to be most fallacious, leads him to the further reflection that nowhere is a lapse of one's credulity easier than where a dignified author supports a false statement. In other passages, he calls experience the best teacher in all things, and contrasts unfavorably garrulity of words and sitting in schools with going to solitudes and seeking herbs at their appropriate seasons. That upon our globe the land is entirely surrounded by water does not require, he says, investigation by arguments, but is now known by experience. And if the salamander really extinguished fire, it would have been tried at Rome long ago. On the other hand, we find some assertions in the natural history which Pliny might easily have tested himself and found false, such as his statement that an eggshell cannot be broken by force or any weight unless it is tipped a little to one side. Sometimes he gives his personal experience, but also mentions experience in many other connections. The word employed most of the time by Pliny to denote experience is experimentum. In many passages the word does not indicate anything like a purposive, prearranged, scientific experiment in our sense of that word, but simply the ordinary experience of daily life. We're also told what experti, or men of experience, advise in a number of passages. However, experimentum is used in a sense somewhat more closely approaching our experiment. These are cases where something is being tested. For instance, a method of determining whether an egg is fresh or rotten by putting it in water and watching if it floats or sinks is called an experimentum. That horses would whinny at no other painting of a horse than that by Apelles is spoken of as Ilius experimentum artis, a test of, or testimony to, his art. The expression religionis experimento is applied to a religious test or ordeal by which the virginity of Claudia was vindicated. The word is also used of ways of telling if unguents are good and if wine is beginning to turn, and of various tests of the genuineness of drugs, gems, earths, and metals. It is also twice used of letting down a lighted lamp into a huge wine cask, or into wells to discover if there is danger at the bottom from noxious vapors. If the lamp was extinguished, it was a sign of peril to human life. Pliny further suggests purposive experimentation in speaking of experimenta to discover water underground and in grafting trees. Most of the tests and experiences thus far mentioned have been practical operations connected with husbandry and industry. But Pliny recounts one or two others which seem to have been dictated solely by scientific curiosity. He classifies the following as experimenta: the sinking of a well to prove by its complete illumination that the sun casts no shadow at noon of the summer solstice; the marking of a dolphin's tail in order to throw some light upon its length of life, should it ever be captured again, as it was 300 years later; perhaps the experiment of longest duration on record, and the casting of a man into a pit of serpents at Rome to determine if he was really immune from their stings. Experimentum is employed by Pliny in a medical sense, which becomes very common in the Middle Ages. He calls some remedies for toothache and inflamed eyes certa experimenta, sure experiences. Later experimentum came to be applied to almost any recipe or remedy. Pliny, indeed, speaks of the doctors as learning at our risk and getting experience through our deaths. In another passage he states more favorably that there is no end to experimenting with everything, so that even poisons are forced to cure us. He also briefly mentions the medical sect of empirics, of whom we shall hear more from Galen. He says that they so named themselves from experiences and originated at Agrigentum, in Sicily under Acron, and Empedocles. Pliny is puzzled how some things which he finds stated in authors famous for wisdom were ever learned by experience. For example, that the starfish has such fiery fervor that it burns everything in the sea which it touches and digests its food instantly. That adamant can be broken only by goat's blood he thinks must have been divinely revealed, for it would hardly have been discovered by chance, and he cannot imagine that anyone would ever have thought of testing a substance of immense value in a fluid of one of the foulest of animals. In several other passages he suggests chance, accident, dreams, or divine revelation as the ways in which the medicinal virtues of certain simples were discovered. Recently, for example, it was discovered that the root of the wild rose is a remedy for hydrophobia by the mother of a soldier in the Praetorian Guard, who was warned in a dream to send her son this root, which cured him and many others who have tried it since. And a soldier in Pompey's time accidentally discovered a cure for elephantiasis when he hid his face for shame in some wild mint leaves. Another herb was accidentally found to be a cure for disorders of the spleen when the entrails of a sacrificial victim happened to be thrown on it, and it entirely consumed the milt. The healing properties of vinegar for the sting of the ASP were discovered by chance in this wise. A man who was stung by an ASP while carrying a leather bottle of vinegar noticed that he felt the sting only when he set the bottle down. He therefore decided to try the effects of a drink of the liquid and was thereby fully cured. Other remedies are learned through the experience of rustics and illiterate persons, and yet others may be discovered by observing animals who cure their ills by them. Pliny's opinion is that the animals have hit upon them by chance. Pliny represents a number of marvelous, and to us incredible things as proved by experience. Divination from thunder, for instance, is supported by innumerable experiences, public and private. In 2 passages out of the 3 mentioning experti, which I cited above, those experienced persons recommended a decidedly magical sort of procedure. In another passage, the experience of many supports a strange observance in plucking a bud. A 4th bit of magical procedure is called marvelous but easily tested. Thus the transition is an easy one from signs of experimental science in the natural history to our next topic, Pliny's account of magic. Oriental origin of magic. Pliny supplies some account of the origin and spread of magic, but a rather confused and possibly unreliable one, as he mentions 2 Zoroasters separated by an interval of 5,000 or 6,000 years, and 2 Ostheneses, one of whom accompanied Xerxes and the other Alexander in their respective expeditions. He says, indeed, that it is not clear whether 1 or 2 Zoroasters existed. In any case, magic has flourished greatly the world over for many centuries, and was founded in Persia by Zoroaster. Some other magicians of Media, Babylonia, and Assyria are mere names to Pliny. Later he mentions others like Apollobex and Dardanus. Although he thus derives magic from the Orient, he appears to make no distinction, as we shall find other writers doing, between the magi of Persia and ordinary magicians, nor does he employ the word magic in 2 senses. He makes it evident, however, that there have been other men who have regarded magic more favorably than he does. Pliny next traces the spread of magic among the Greeks. He marvels at the lack of it in the Iliad and the abundance of it in the Odyssey. He is uncertain whether to class Orpheus as a magician, and mentions Thessaly as famous for its witches at least as early as the time of Menander, who named one of his comedies after them. But he regards the Osthenes who accompanied Xerxes as the prime introducer of magic to the Greek-speaking world, which straightway went mad over it. In order to learn more of it, the philosophers Pythagoras, Empedocles, Democritus, and Plato went into distant exile, and on their return disseminated their lore. Pliny regards the works of Democritus as the greatest single factor in that dissemination of the doctrines of magic which occurred at about the same time that medicine was being developed by the works of Hippocrates. Some regarded the books on magic ascribed to Democritus as spurious, but Pliny insists that they are genuine. Outside of the Greek-speaking world, whence of course magic spread to Rome, Pliny mentions Jewish magic, represented by such names as Moses, Jannes, and Latapes. But he holds that magic did not originate among the Hebrews until long after Zoroaster. He also speaks of the magic of Cyprus, of the Druids, who were the magicians, diviners, and medicine men of Gaul until the Emperor Tiberius suppressed them, and of distant Britain. Thus discordant nations, and even those ignorant of one another's existence, agree the world over in their devotion to magic. From what Pliny tells us elsewhere of the Scythians, we can see that the nomads of the Russian steppes and Turkestan were devoted to magic too. It has been shown that Pliny regarded magic as a mass of doctrines formulated by a single founder, and not as a gradual social evolution, just as the Greeks and Romans ascribed their laws and customs to some single legislator. He admits in a way, however, the great antiquity claimed by magic for itself, although he questions how the bulky dicta of Zoroaster and Dardanus could have been handed down by memory during so long a period. This remark again shows how little he thinks of magic as a set of social customs and attitudes perpetuated through constant and universal practice from generation to generation. Yet what he says of its widespread prevalence among unconnected peoples goes to prove this. Pliny has a clearer comprehension of the extensive scope of magic and of its essential characteristics, at least as it was in his day. No one should wonder, he says, that its authority has been very great, since alone of the arts it has embraced and united with itself the three other subjects which make the greatest appeal to the human mind, namely, medicine, religion, and the arts of divination, especially astrology. That his phrase Ars Mathematicas has reference to astrology is shown by his immediately continuing, since there is no one who is not eager to learn the future about himself, and who does not think that this is most truly revealed by the sky. But magic further promises to reveal the future by water and spheres and air and stars and lamps and basins and the blades of axes, and by many other methods, besides conferences with shades from the infernal regions. There can therefore be no doubt that Pliny regards the various arts of divination as parts of magic. While we have heard Pliny assert in general the close connection between magic and religion, the character of the natural history, which deals with natural rather than religious matters, does not lead him to enter into much further detail upon this point. His occasional mention of religious usages in his own day, however, supports our information from other sources that the original Roman religion was very largely composed of magic forces, rules, and ceremonial. Nearly half the books of the natural history deal in whole or in part with remedies for diseases, and it is therefore of the relations between magic and natural science, and more particularly between magic and medicine, that Pliny gives us the most detailed information. Indeed, he asserts that no one doubts that magic originally sprang from medicine and crept in under the show of promoting health as a loftier and more sacred medicine. Magic and medicine have developed together, and the latter is now in imminent danger of being overwhelmed by the follies of magic, which have made men doubt whether plants possess any medicinal properties. In the opinion of many, however, magic is sound and beneficial learning. In antiquity, and for that matter at almost all times, the height of literary fame and glory has been sought from that science. Eudoxus would have it the most noted and useful of all schools of philosophy. Empedocles and Plato studied it. Pythagoras and Democritus perpetuated it in their writings. But Pliny himself feels that the assertions of the books of magic are fantastic, exaggerated, and untrue. He repeatedly brands the magi or magicians as fools or impostors, and their statements as absurd and impudent tissues of lies. Remedies, or nonsense, is his stock word for their beliefs. Some of their writings must, in his opinion, have been dictated by a feeling of contempt and derision for humanity. Nero proved the falseness of the art, for although he studied magic eagerly, and with his unlimited wealth and power had every opportunity to become a skillful practitioner, he was unable to work any marvels and abandoned the attempt. Pliny therefore comes to the conclusion that magic is invalid and empty, yet has some shadows of truth, which however do more to poisons than to magic. The last remark brings us to charges of evil practices made against the magicians. Besides poisons, they specialize in love potions and drugs to produce abortions, and some of their operations are inhuman or obscene and abominable. They attempt baleful sorcery or the transfer of disease from one person to another. Osthenes and even Democritus propound such remedies as drinking human blood or utilizing in magic compounds and ceremonies parts of the corpses of men who have been violently slain. Pliny thinks that humanity owes a great debt to the Roman government for abolishing those monstrous rites of human sacrifice, in which to slay a man was thought most pious. Nay more, to eat men was thought most wholesome. Pliny nevertheless lays less stress upon the moral argument against magic as criminal or indecent than he does upon the intellectual objection to it as untrue and unscientific. Indeed, so far as decency is concerned, his own medicine will be seen to be far from prudish, while he elsewhere gives instances of magicians guarding against defilement. Moreover, among the methods employed and the results sought by magic which he frequently mentions, there are comparatively few that are morally objectionable, although they seem, without exception, false. But many of their recipes aim at the cure of disease and other worthy, or at least admissible, objects. Possibly Pliny has somewhat censored their lore and tried to exclude all criminal secrets, but his censure seems more intellectual than moral. For instance, he fills a long chapter with extract from a treatise on the virtues of the chameleon and its parts by Democritus, whom he regards as a leading purveyor of magic lore. In opening the chapter, Pliny hails, with great pleasure, the opportunity to expose the lies of Greek vanity. But at its close he expresses a wish that Democritus himself had been touched with the branch of a palm, which he said prevents immoderate loquacity. Pliny then adds more charitably, "It is evident that this man, who in other respects was a wise and most useful member of society, has erred from too great zeal in serving humanity." Pliny himself fails to maintain a consistently skeptical attitude towards magic. His exact attitude is often hard to determine. Often it is difficult to say whether he is speaking in sober earnest or in a tone of light and easy pleasantry and sarcasm, as in the passage just cited concerning Democritus. Another puzzling point is his frequent excuse that he will list certain assertions of the magicians in order to expose or confute them. But really he usually simply sets them forth, apparently expecting that their inherent and patent absurdity will prove a sufficient refutation of them. On the rare occasions when he undertakes to indicate in what the absurdity consists, his reasoning is scarcely scientific or convincing. Thus he affirms that it is a peculiar proof of the vanity of the magicians that of all animals they most admire moles who are condemned by nature in so many ways, to perpetual blindness and to dig in the darkness as if they were buried. And he assails the belief of the Magi that an owl's egg is good for diseases of the scalp by asking, "Who, I beg, could ever have seen an owl's egg, since it is a prodigy to see the bird itself. Moreover, he sometimes cites assertions of the magicians without any censure, apology, or expression of disbelief. And there are many other passages where it is practically impossible to tell whether he is citing the magicians or not. Sometimes he will apparently continue to refer to them by a pronoun in chapters where they have not been mentioned by name at all. In other places, he will imperceptibly cease to quote the Magi, and after an interval, perhaps, as imperceptibly resume citation of their doctrines. It is also difficult to determine just when writers like Democritus and Pythagoras are to be regarded as representatives of magic, and when their statements are accepted by Pliny as those of sound philosophers. Perhaps, despite Pliny's occasional brave efforts to withstand and even ridicule the assertions of the magicians, he could not free himself from a secret liking for them, and more than half believe them. At any rate, he believed very similar things. Even more likely is it that previous works on nature were so full of such material, and the readers of his own day so interested in it, that he could not but include much of it. Once he explains that certain statements are scarcely to be taken seriously, yet should not be omitted, because they have been transmitted from a past. Again, he begs the reader's indulgence for similar vanities of the Greeks, because this too has its value that we should know whatever marvels they have transmitted. The truth of the matter probably is that Pliny rejected some assertions of the magicians, but found others acceptable. That he gets his occasional attitude of skepticism and ridicule of their doctrines from one set of authorities, and his moments of unquestioning acceptance of their statements from other authors on whom he relies. Very likely in the books which he used it often was no clearer than it is in the natural history whether a statement was to be ascribed to the Magi or not. Very possibly Pliny was as confused in his own mind concerning the entire business as he seems to be to us. He could no more keep magic out of his natural history than poor Mr. Dick could keep Charles I's head out of his book. One fact at any rate stands out clearly: the prominence of magic in his encyclopedia and in the learning of his age. Here I shall rather strictly limit my survey to those statements which Pliny definitely ascribes by name to the Magi or magic art. The most striking fact is that the magicians are cited again and again concerning the supposed properties, virtues, and effects of things in nature, herbs, animals, and stones. These virtues are, it is true, often employed in an effort to produce wonderful results, and often too they are combined with some fantastic rite or superstitious ceremonial performed by a human agent. But in many cases, either no rite at all is suggested, or merely some simple medicinal application. And in a few cases, there is no mention of any particular operation or result. The magicians are cited simply as authorities concerning the great but unspecified virtues of natural objects. Indeed, they stand out in Pliny's pages not as mere sorcerers or enchanters or wonder-workers, but as those who have gone the farthest and in most detail, too far and too curiously in Pliny's opinion, into the study of medicine and of nature. Sometimes their statements, cited without censure, supplement others concerning the species under discussion. Sometimes they are his sole source of information on the subject in hand. Pliny connects the origin of botany rather closely with magic, mentioning Medea and Circe as early investigators of plants, and Orpheus among the first writers on the subject. Moreover, Pythagoras and Democritus borrowed from the Magi of the Orient in their works on the properties of plants. There would be little profit in repeating the names of the herbs concerning which Pliny gives opinions of the magicians, inasmuch as few of them can be associated with any plants known today. Suffice it to say that Pliny makes no objection to the herbs which they employed, nor does he criticize their methods of employing them, although some seem superstitious enough to the modern reader. A chaplet is worn of one herb. Others are plucked with the left hand and with a statement of what they are to be used for, and in one case without looking backward. The anemone is to be plucked when it first appears that year with a statement of its intended use, and then is to be wrapped in a red cloth and kept in the shade, and, whenever anyone falls sick of tertian or quartan fever, is to be bound on the patient's body. The heliotrope is not to be plucked at all, but tied in 3 or 4 knots with a prayer that the patient may recover to untie the knots. Pliny does not even object to the marvelous results which the Magi think can be gained by use of herbs until towards the close of his 24th book, although already in his 20th and 21st books such powers have been claimed for herbs as to make one well-favored and enable one to attain one's desires, or to give one grace and glory. At the end of his 24th book, he states that Pythagoras and Democritus, following the Magi, ascribed to herbs unusually marvelous virtues such as to freeze water, invoke spirits, force the guilty to confess by frightening them with apparitions, and impart the gift of divination. Early in his 25th book, Pliny suggests that some incredible effects have been attributed to herbs by the Magi and their disciples. And in a later chapter, he describes the Magi as so mad about vervain that they think that if they are anointed with it, they can gain their wishes, drive away fevers and other diseases, and make friendships. The herb should be plucked about the rising of the dog star when there is neither sun nor moon. Honey and honeycomb should be offered to appease the earth. Then the plant should be dug around with iron with the left hand and raised aloft. By the time he reaches his 26th book, Pliny's courage is risen, so to speak, enough to cause him at last to enter upon quite a tirade against magical vanities which have been carried so far that they might destroy faith in herbs entirely. As examples, he mentions herbs supposed to dry up rivers and swamps, open barred doors at their touch, turn hostile armies to flight, and supply all the needs of the ambassadors of the Persian kings. He wonders why such herbs have never been employed in Roman warfare or Italian drainage. Pliny's only objection to magic herbs, therefore, seems to be the excessive powers which are claimed for some of them. He adds that it would be strange that the credulity which arose from such wholesome beginnings had reached such a pitch. If human ingenuity observed moderation in anything, and if the much more recent system of medicine, which Asclepiades founded, could not be shown to have been carried even beyond the magicians. Here again we see Pliny failing to recognize magic as a primitive social product and regarding it as a degeneration from ancient science rather than science as a comparatively modern development from it. But he may well be right in thinking that many particular far-fetched recipes and rites were the late, artificial product of over-scholarly magicians. Thus he brands as false and magical the assertion of a recent grammarian, Apian, that the herb cynocephalia is divine and a safeguard against poison, but kills the man who uproots it entirely. In a few cases, Pliny objects to the animals or parts of animals employed by the Magi, as in the passage already cited where he complains that they admire moles more than any other animals. But his assertion is inconsistent, since he has already affirmed that they hold the hyena in most admiration of all animals on the ground, that it works magic upon man. Their promise of readier favor with peoples and kings to those who anoint themselves with lion's fat, especially the between the eyebrows, he criticizes by declaring that no fat can be found there. He also twits the Magi for magnifying the importance of so nasty a creature as the tick. They are attracted to it by the fact that it has no outlet to its body and can live only 7 days, even if it fasts. Whether there is any astrological significance in the number 7, here Pliny does not say. He does inform us, however, that the cricket is employed in magic because it moves backward. A very bizarre object employed by the Druids and other magicians is a sort of egg produced by the hissing or foam of snakes. The blood of the basilisk may also be classed as a rarity. Apparently, animals in some way unusual are preferred in magic, like a black sheep, but the logic and the reasons given by Pliny for their selection is not clear in every instance. In some other cases not criticized by Pliny, we have plainly enough sympathetic magic, or the principle of cures, as when the milt of a calf or sheep is used to cure diseases of the human spleen. The magicians, however, do not scorn to use familiar and easily obtainable animals like the goat and dog and cat. The liver and dung of a cat, a puppy's brains, the blood and genitals of a dog, and the gall of a black male dog are among the animal substances employed. Such substances as those just named are equally in demand from other animals. Minute parts of animals are frequently employed by the magicians, such as the toe of an owl, the liver of a mouse given in a fig, the tooth of a live mole, the stones from young swallows' gizzards, the eyes of river crabs. Sometimes the part employed is reduced to ashes, perhaps a relic of sacrificial custom. Thus, for toothache, the magi inject into the ear nearer the tooth the ashes of the head of a mad dog and oil of cypress, while they prescribe for affections of the sinews the ashes of an owl's head and honeyed wine with lily root. Other living creatures which Pliny mentions as used by the magi are the salamander, earthworm, bat, scarab with reflex horns, lizard, tortoise, bedbug, frog, and sea urchin. The dragon's tail wrapped in a gazelle's skin and bound on with deer sinews cures epilepsy, and a mixture of the dragon's tongue, eyes, gall, and intestines, boiled in oil, cooled in the night air, and rubbed on morning and evening, frees one from nocturnal apparitions. Sometimes the parts of animals are bound on outside the patient's body. Sometimes the injured portion of his body is merely touched with them. Once the whole house is to be fumigated with the substance in question. Once the walls are to be sprinkled with it. Once it is to be buried under the threshold. Some instances follow of more elaborate magic ritual connected with the use of animals or parts of animals. The hyena is more easily captured by a hunter who ties 7 knots in his girdle and horsewhip, and it should be captured when the moon is in the sign of Gemini, and without the loss of a single hair. Another bit of astrology dispensed by the Magi is that the cat, whose salted liver is taken with wine for quartan fever, should have been killed under a waning moon. To cure incontinence of urine, one not only drinks ashes of a boar's genitals and sweet wine, but afterwards urinates in a dog kennel and repeats the formula, that I may not urinate like a dog in its kennel. The magicians insist that the sex of the patient be observed in administering burnt cow dung or bull dung and honeyed wine for cases of dropsy. For infantile ailments, the brains of a she-goat should be passed through a gold ring and dropped in the baby's mouth before it is given its milk. After the fresh milt of a sheep has been applied to the patient with the words, "This I do for the cure of the spleen," it should be plastered into the bedroom wall and sealed with a ring, while the charm should be repeated 27 times. In treating sciatica, an earthworm should be placed in a broken wooden dish mended with an iron band. The dish should be filled with water. The worm should be buried again where it was dug up, and the water should be drunk by the patient. The eyes of river crabs are to be attached to the patient's person before sunrise, and the blinded crabs put back into the water. After it has been carried around the house, thrice a bat may be nailed head down outside a window as an amulet. For epilepsy goats, flesh should be given which has been roasted on a funeral pyre, and the animal's gall should not be allowed to touch the ground. Pliny occasionally speaks in a vague general way of his citations from the Magi concerning the virtues of parts of animals as lies or nonsense or portentous, but he does not specifically criticize their procedure any more than he did their methods of employing herbs, and he does not criticize their promised results as much as he did before. Indeed, as we have already indicated, The object in a majority of cases is purely medicinal. The purpose of others is pastoral or agricultural, such as preventing goats from straying or causing swine to follow you. The blood of the basilisk, however, is said to procure answers to petitions made to the powerful and prayers addressed to the gods, and to act as a safeguard against poison or sorcery, beneficiarum amuleta. Invincibility is promised the wearer of the head and tail of a dragon, hairs from a lion's forehead, a lion's marrow, the foam of a winning horse, a dog's claw bound in deer skin, and the muscles alternately of a deer and a gazelle. A woman will tell secrets in her sleep if the heart of an owl is applied to her right breast, and power of divination is gained by eating the still palpitating heart of mole. In the case of stones, the names are again, as in the case of herbs, of little significance for us. The accompanying ritual is slight. There are 1 or 2 suspensions from the neck or elsewhere by such means as a lion's mane. The hair of the hyena will not do at all, nor the hair of the cynocephaly and swallow's feathers. There is some use of incantations with the stones, a setting of iron for 1 stone, burial of another beneath a tree that it may not dull the axe, and placing another on the tongue after rinsing the mouth with honey at certain days and hours of the moon in order to acquire the gift of divination. Indeed, the results promised are all marvelous. The stones benefit public speakers, admit to the presence of royalty, counteract fascination and sorcery, avert hail, thunderbolts, storms, locusts, and scorpions, chill boiling water, produce family discord, render athletes invincible, quench anger and violence, make one invisible, evoke images of the gods and shades from the infernal regions. We have yet to mention a group of magical recipes and remedies which Pliny for some reason collects in 1 chapter, but which hardly fall under any one head. A whetstone on which iron tools are sharpened, if placed without his knowledge under the pillow of a man who has been poisoned, will cause him to reveal all the circumstances of the crime. If you turn a man who has been struck by lightning over on his injured side, he will speak at once. To cure tumors in the groin, tie 7 or 9 knots in the remnant of a weaver's web, naming some widow as each knot is tied. The pain is assuaged by binding to the body the nail that has been trod on. To get rid of warts, on the 20th day of the moon lie flat in a path gazing at the moon. Stretch the hands above the head and rub the warts with anything that comes to hand. A corn may be extracted successfully at the moment a star shoots. Headache may be relieved by a liniment made by pouring vinegar on door hinges or by binding a hangman's noose about the patient's temples. To dislodge a fishbone stuck in the throat, plunge the feet into cold water. To dislodge some other sort of bone, place bones on the head. To dislodge a morsel of bread, stuff bits of bread into both ears. We may add from a neighboring chapter a very magical remedy for fevers, although Pliny calls it the most modest of their promises. Toe and fingernail parings mixed with wax are to be attached ere sunrise to another person's door in order to transfer the disease from the patient to him, or they may be placed near an anthill, in which case the first ant who tries to drag one inside the hill should be captured and suspended from the patient's neck. Such is the picture we derive from numerous passages in the natural history of the magic art, its materials and rites, the effects it seeks to produce, and its general attitude towards nature. Besides the natural materials employed and the marvelous results sought, we have noted the frequent use of ligatures, suspensions, and amulets, the observance of astrological conditions, of certain times and numbers, rules for plucking herbs and tying knots, stress on the use of the right or left hand. In other words, on position or direction, some employment of incantations, some sacrifice and fumigation, some specimens of sympathetic magic, of the theory that like cures like, and of other types of magic logic. We shall find many striking resemblances, and shall soon come to a realization that there is more magic in the natural history, which is not attributed to the Magi, than there is that is. Pliny did not need to warn us that medicine had been corrupted by magic. His own medicine proves it. It is this fact that virtually his entire work is crammed with marvelous properties and fantastic ceremonial, which makes it so difficult in some places to tell when he begins to draw material from the Magi and when he leaves off. By a detailed analysis of this remaining material, we shall now attempt to classify the substances of which Pliny makes use and the virtues which he ascribes to them, the rites and methods of procedure by which they are employed, and certain superstitious doctrines and notions which are involved. We shall thus find that almost precisely the same factors are present in his science as in the lore of the magicians. Of substances we may begin with animals, and before we note the human use of their virtues with its strong suggestion of magic, may remark another unscientific and superstitious feature which was very common both in ancient and medieval times. This is the tendency to humanize animals, ascribing to them conscious motives, habits, and ruses, or even moral standards and religious veneration. We shall have occasion to note the same thing in other authors, and so will give but a few specimens from the many in the natural history. Such qualities are attributed by Pliny especially to elephants, whom he ranks next to man in intelligence, and whom he represents as worshipping the stars, learning difficult tricks, and as having a sense of justice, feeling of mercy, and so on. Similarly, the lion has noble courage and a sense of gratitude, while the lioness is wily in the devices by which she conceals her amours with the pard. A number of the devices of fishes to escape hooks and nets are repeated by Pliny from Ovid's Heliodicon, extant only in fragments. The crocodile opens its jaws to have its teeth picked by a friendly bird, but sometimes while this operation is being performed the ichneumon darts down its throat like a javelin and eats away its intestines. Pliny also marvels at the cleverness displayed by the dragon and the elephant in their combats with one another, which, however, almost invariably terminate fatally to both combatants, the elephant falling exhausted in the dragon's coils and crushing the serpent by its weight. Others say that in the hot summer the dragons thirst for the blood of the elephant, which is very cold. In their combat the elephant falls drained of its blood and crushes the dragon, who is intoxicated by the same. The dragon's apparent knowledge that the elephant is cold-blooded leads us to a kindred topic, the remedies used by animals, and often discovered by men only by seeing animals use them. This notion continued in the Middle Ages, as we shall see, and of course it did not originate with Pliny. As he says himself, the ancients have recorded the remedies of wild beasts, and shown how they are healed even when poisoned. Against aconite the scorpion eats white hellebore as an antidote, while the panther employs human excrement. Animals prepare themselves for combats with poisonous snakes by eating certain herbs. The weasel eats rue. The tortoise and deer use 2 other plants, while field mice who have been stung by snakes eat chondrian. The hawk tears open the hawkweed and sprinkles its eyes with the juice. The serpent tastes fennel when it sheds its old skin. Sick bears cure themselves by a diet of ants. Swallows restore the sight of their young with Caledonia or swallowwort. And the historian Xanthus says that the dragon restores its dead offspring to life with an herb called balis. The hippopotamus was the original discoverer of bleeding, opening a vein in his leg by wounding himself on sharp reeds along the shore, and afterwards checking the flow of blood by plastering the place with mud. Pliny, however, states in one passage that animals hit upon all these remedies by chance, and even have to rediscover them by accident in each new case, since he continues in conformity with recent animal psychologists. reason and practice cannot be transmitted between wild beasts. Yet in another passage, Pliny deplores the spitefulness of the dog which, while men are looking, will not pluck the herb by which it cures itself of snakebite. Probably Pliny is using different authorities in the two passages. Theophrastus, the pupil of Aristotle, had written a work on jealous animals. More excusable than the spitefulness of the dog is the attitude of the dragon, from whose brain the gem draconitis must be taken while the dragon is alive and preferably asleep. For if the dragon feels that it is mortally wounded, it takes revenge by spoiling the gem. Elephants know that men hunt them only for their tusks, and so bury these when they fall off. Animals have marvelous virtues of their own other than the medicinal uses to which men have put them. For instance, the mere glance of the basilisk is fatal, and its breath burns up vegetation and breaks rocks. But the medicinal effects which Pliny ascribes to animals and parts of animals are well nigh infinite. Many animal substances will have to be introduced in other connections so that we need mention now, but a very few. The heads and blood of flies, honey in which bees have died, Cinera genitalis acini, chicks in the egg, and thrice 7 centipedes diluted with Attic honey. This last a prescription for asthma, and to be taken through a reed because it blackens every dish by its contact. Another passage advises eating a rat or shrew mouse in order to bear a baby with black eyes. These items are enough to convince us that the animals and parts of animals employed by the magicians were not one whit more bizarre and nauseating than the others found in the natural history, nor were the cures which they were expected to work any more improbable. In order to illustrate, however, the delicate distinctions which were imagined to exist not only between the virtues of different parts of the same animal, but also between slightly varied uses of the same part, we may note that scales scraped from the topmost part of a tortoise's shell and administered in drink-check sexual desire, considering which it is, as Pliny remarks, the more marvelous that a powder made of the entire shell is reported to arouse lust. But love turns readily to hatred in magic as well as in romance, and it is nothing very unusual, as we shall find in other authors, for the same thing on slight provocation to work in exactly opposite ways. Pig grease, Pliny somewhere informs us, possesses a specially strong virtue, because that animal feeds on the roots of herbs. From the virtues of animals, therefore, let us turn to those of herbs. Pliny met on every hand assertion of their wonderful powers. The empire builders of Rome employed the sacred herbs sagmina and verbena in their embassies and legations. The Gauls, too, used the verbena in lot casting and prophetic responses. Pliny also states more skeptically that there is another root which diviners take and drink in order to feign inspiration. The Scythians know of a plant which prevents hunger and thirst if held in the mouth, and of another which has the same effect upon their horses, so that they can go for 12 days without meat or drink, an exaggerated estimate of the hardihood of the mounted Asiatic nomads and their steeds. Musaeus and Hesiod say that one anointed with Polion will attain fame and dignities. Pliny perhaps did not intend to subscribe fully to such statements, although he cannot be said to call many of them into question. He did complain that some writers had asserted incredible powers of herbs, such as to restore dragons or men to life or withdraw wedges from trees. Yet he seems on the whole in sympathy with the opinion of the majority that there is practically nothing which the force of herbs cannot accomplish. Herophilus, illustrious in medicine, had said that certain herbs were beneficial if merely trod upon, and Pliny himself says the same of more than one plant. He tells us further that binding the wild fig tree about their necks makes the fiercest bulls stand immobile, that another plant subjects fractious beasts of burden to the yoke, while cows who eat buprestis burst asunder. Another intacto genitally kills any female animal. Peony is considered an amulet for houses, and fishermen in Pliny's neighborhood mix a plant with chalk and scatter it on the waves. The fish dart towards it with marvelous desire, and straightway float lifeless on the surface. Dogs will not bark at persons carrying peristerios. The impious plant prevents any human being who tastes it from having quinsy, while swine are sure to have that disease if they do not eat it. Some place it in birds' nests to prevent the voracious nestlings from strangling. Bitter almonds provide another amusing combination of effects. Eating 5 of them permits one to drink without experiencing intoxication. But if foxes eat them, they will die unless they find water nearby to drink. There are some herbs which have a medicinal effect, if one merely looks at them. In 2 cases, the masculine or feminine variety of a herb is used to secure the birth of a child of the desired sex. That the plucking of herbs and digging up of roots was a process very apt to be attended by magical procedure, we find abundant evidence in the natural history. Often plants should be plucked before sunrise. Twice Pliny tells us that the peony should be uprooted by night, lest the woodpecker of Mars try to pick the digger's eyes out. The state of the moon is another point to be observed, and once an herb is to be gathered before thunder is heard. A common instruction is to pick the plant with the left hand, and once with the thumb and fourth finger of the left hand. Once the right hand should be stretched covertly after the fashion of a pickpocket through the left sleeve in order to pluck the plant. Sometimes one faces east in plucking herbs, sometimes west. Again, one is careful not to face the wind. Sometimes the gatherer must not glance behind him. Sometimes he must fast before he takes the plant from the ground. Again, he must observe a state of chastity. Sometimes he should be barefoot and clothed in white. Again, he should remove every stitch of clothing and even his rings. Sometimes the use of iron implements is forbidden. Again, gold or some other material is prescribed. Once the herb is to be dug with a nail. Sometimes circles are traced about the plant with the point of a sword. Often the plant must not touch the ground again after it is picked, presumably from a fear that its virtue would run off like an electric current. Pliny alludes at least 3 times to the practice of herbalists of retaining portions of the herbs they sell, and then, if they are not paid in full, replanting the herb in the same spot with the idea that thereby the disease will return to plague the delinquent patient. Frequently one is directed to state why one plucks the herb or for whom it is intended. In one case the digger says, "This is the herb argman, which Minerva discovered was a remedy for swine who taste it." In another case, one should salute the plant and extract its juice before saying a word. Thus its virtue will be much greater. In other cases, as an offering to appease the earth, the soil about the plant is soaked with hydromel 3 months before plucking it, or the hole left by pulling it up is filled with different kinds of grain. Sometimes one sacrifices beforehand with bread and wine or praise to the gods for permission to gather the herb. The customs of the Druids in gathering herbs are mentioned more than once. In gathering the sacred mistletoe on the 6th day of the moon, they hold sacrifices and a banquet beneath the tree. 2 white bulls are the victims. A priest clad in white cuts the mistletoe with a golden sickle and receives it in a white cloak. To Pliny's discussion of herbs, we may append some specimens of the employment of magic procedure in agriculture and of the superstitions of the peasantry, in which his pages abound. To guard against diseases of grain, the seeds before planting should be steeped in wine. The juice of a certain herb, the gall of a cow, or human urine, or should be touched with the shoulders of a mole. The animal whose use by the Magi we heard Pliny ridicule. One should sow at the moon's conjunction. Before the field is hoed, a frog should be carried around it, and then buried in the center in an earthen vessel. but it should be disinterred before harvest, lest the millet be bitter. Birds may be kept away from the grain by planting in the four corners of the field an herb whose name is unfortunately unknown to Pliny. Mice are kept out by the ashes of a weasel, mildew by laurel branches, caterpillars by placing the skull of a female beast of burden upon a stick in the garden. To ward off fogs and storms from orchards and vineyards, a frog may be buried, as directed above, or live crabs may be burned in the trees, or a painted grape may be consecrated. Suspending a frog in the granary preserves the corn stored there. To keep wolves away, catch one, break its legs, attach it to the plowshare, and thus scatter its blood about the boundaries of the field. Then bury the carcass at the starting point, or consecrate at the altar of the law of the plowshare with which the first furrow was traced. Foxes will not touch poultry who have eaten the dried liver of a fox, or who wear a bit of its skin about their necks. Fern will not spring up again if it is mowed with the edge of a reed, or uprooted by a plowshare upon which a reed has been placed. Of the use of incantations in agriculture we shall treat later. Pliny appears to have much less faith in the possession of marvelous virtues by gems than by herbs and parts of animals. He not only characterizes the powers attributed to gems by the Magi and Democritus and Pythagoras as terrible lies and unspeakable nonsense, but refrains from mentioning many such himself, or inserts a cautious, if we believe it, or if they tell the truth. Of the gems supposed to be produced from the urine of the lynx, he says, "I think that this is quite false, and no gem of that name has been seen in our time. What is stated concerning its medicinal virtue is also false." To other stones, however, he ascribes various medicinal virtues, either when taken pulverized in drink or when worn as amulets. A few other occult properties are stated without reservation, as that amiantus resists all sorceries, that adamant expels idle fears from the mind, that sideritis produces discord and litigation, and that eumesis, placed beneath one's pillow at night, causes oracular visions. Magnets are said to differ in sex, and the belief of Theophrastus and Mucianus is repeated that certain stones bear offspring. Of the metals, iron sometimes figures in Pliny's magical procedure, as when he either prescribes or taboos the use of it in cutting herbs or killing animals. In Arcadia, the yew tree is a fatal poison to persons sleeping beneath it, but driving a copper nail into the tree makes it harmless. Pliny says that gold is medicinal in many ways, and in particular is applied to wounded persons and to infants as a safeguard against witchcraft. Earth itself is often used to work marvels, but usually some particular portion, such as that between cart ruts, or that thrown up by ants, beetles, and moles, or in the right footprint where one first heard cuckoos sing. However, the rule that an object should not touch the ground is enforced in many other connections than the plucking of herbs, and Pliny twice states that the earth will not permit a serpent who has stung a human being to re-enter its hole. In his discussion of metals, Pliny does not allude to transmutation or alchemy, unless it be in his accounts of various fraudulent practices of workers in metal, and how Caligula extracted gold from orpiment. But the following directions for preparing antimony show how closely akin to magic the procedure in ancient metallurgy might be. The antimony should be coated with cow flap and burnt in furnaces, then quenched in woman's milk and pounded in mortars with an admixture of rainwater. Various parts and products of the human body are credited with remarkable virtues, as the mention just made of woman's milk suggests. Other passages recommend, more especially the milk of a woman just delivered of a male child, but most of all that of the mother of twins. Sed nihil facile reperiator mulierum per fluvio magis monstrificum, as Pliny proceeds to illustrate by numerous examples. Great virtues are also attributed to the urine, particularly of a chaste boy. A few other instances of remedies drawn from the human body are earwax or a powdered tooth against stings of scorpions and bites of snakes, a man's hair for the bite of a dog, the first hairs from a boy's head for gout. Diseases of women are prevented by wearing constantly in a bracelet the first tooth a boy loses, provided it has not touched the ground. Simply tying 2 fingers or toes together is recommended for tumors in the groin, catarrh, and sore eyes. Or the eyes may be touched thrice with water in which the feet have been washed. Scrofula and throat diseases may be cured by the touch of the hand of one who has died an early death. Although some authorities do not insist upon the circumstance of early death, but direct that the corpse be of the same sex as the patient, and that the diseased spot be touched with the back of the left dead hand. Of all fluids and excretions of the human body, the saliva is perhaps used most often in ancient and medieval medicine, as the custom of spitting once or thrice in administering other remedies or performing ceremonies goes to prove. The spittle of a fasting person is the more efficacious. In a chapter devoted particularly to the properties of human saliva, Pliny lists many diseases and woes which it alleviates. In this connection, he makes the following absurd assertion, which he nevertheless declares is easily tested by experiment. If a person repents of a blow given from a distance or hand to hand, let him spit into the palm of the hand with which he struck, and the person who has been struck will feel no resentment. This is often proved by beasts of burden who are induced to mend their pace by this method after the use of the whip has failed. Pliny adds, however, that some persons try to increase the force of their blows by thus spitting on the hand beforehand. He also mentions as countercharms against sorcery the practices of spitting into one's urine or right shoe, or when crossing a dangerous spot. The importance of the human operator as a factor in the performance of marvels, be they medical or magical, is attested by the frequent injunctions of chastity, virginity, nudity, or a state of fasting upon persons concerned in Pliny's procedure. Sometimes they are not to glance behind them. Sometimes they are to speak to no one during the operation. Pliny also mentions men who have a special capacity for wonder-working, such as Pyrrhus, the touch of whose toe had healing power, those whose eyes exert strong fascination, whole tribes of serpent charmers and venom curers, and others whose mere presence addles the eggs beneath a setting hen. The power of words spoken by man will be considered separately under the head of incantations. While Pliny attributes the most extreme medicinal virtues to simples, he excludes from his natural history the strange and elaborate compounds which were nevertheless so popular in the pharmacy of his age. Of one simple, laser, he says that it would be an immense task to attempt to list all the uses that it is supposed to have in compounds. His position is that the simple remedies alone are the direct work of nature, while the mixtures, tablets, pills, plasters, washes are artificial inventions of the apothecaries. Once when he describes a compound called remedies, which aids in the generation of good and beautiful children, it seems to be borrowed by Democritus from the Magi. Furthermore, Pliny thinks that health can be sufficiently preserved or restored by nature's simple remedies. Compounds are the invention of human conjecture, avarice, and impudence. Such conjecture is often false, not sufficiently taking into account the natural sympathies and antipathies of the numerous ingredients. Often compounds are inexplicable. Pliny also deplores resort to imported drugs from India, Arabia, and the Red Sea, when there are homely remedies at hand for the poorest man. We have just heard Pliny refer to the sympathies and antipathies of natural simples, and he often explains the marvelous effects of natural objects upon one another by this relation of love and hatred, friendship or repugnance, discord or concord which exists between them, which the Greeks call sympathy or antipathy, and which Heraclitus was perhaps the first philosopher to insist upon. Some modern students of magic have tried to account for all magic on this theory, and Pliny states that medicine and medicines originated from it. This relationship exists between animals, deer and snakes, for example. So great a force is it that stags track snakes to their holes and extract them thence despite all resistance by the power of their breath. This antipathy continues after death, for the sovereign remedy for snake bite is the rennet of a fawn killed in its mother's womb, while serpents flee from a man who wears the tooth of a deer. But antipathy may change to sympathy, for Pliny adds that in some cases certain parts of deer treated in certain ways attract serpents. This force of antipathy is indeed capable of taking the strangest turn. Bedbugs, foul and disgusting as they are, heal the bite of snakes, especially asps, and sows can eat the poisonous salamander. The antipathy between goats and snakes would seem almost as potent as that between deer and snakes, since we are told that snake-bitten persons recover more quickly if they frequent the stalls where goats are kept, or wear, as an amulet, the paunch of a she-goat. There is also the hatred and friendship of deaf and insensible things. Instances are the magnet's attraction for iron and the fact that adamant can be broken only by the blood of a he-goat. Two stock examples of occult influence and natural marvels, which continued classic in the medieval period. Pliny indeed regards this last as the clearest illustration possible of the potency of sympathy and antipathy, since a substance which defies iron and fire, nature's two most violent agents, yields to the blood of a foul animal. There is furthermore sympathy and antipathy between animate and inanimate objects. So marvelous is the antipathy of the tamarisk tree for the spleen alone of internal organs, that pigs who drink from troughs of this wood are found when slaughtered to be without spleen, and hence splenetic patients are fed from vessels of tamarisk. The spleenless pig, it may be interpolated, is another commonplace of ancient and medieval science. Smearing the hives with cow dung kills other insects, but stimulates the bees who have an affinity for it. Cognatum hoc ius, probably, although Pliny does not say so, on the theory that they are spontaneously generated from it. That the wild cabbage is hostile to dogs is evidenced by the statement of Epicharmus that it cures the bite of a mad dog, but kills a dog if he eats it when given to him with meat. Snakes hate the ash tree so that if they are hemmed in by its foliage on one side and fire on the other, they flee by preference into the flames. Betterney, too, is so antipathetic to snakes that they lash themselves to death when a circle of it is drawn about them. Scorpions cannot survive in the air of Sicily. Perhaps antipathy is also the explanation of Pliny's absurd statement that loads of apples and pears, even if there are only a few of them, are very heavy for beasts of burden. Here, however, the condition may be remedied, and perhaps a relationship of sympathy established by showing the beasts how few fruit there really are, or by giving them some to eat. That sympathy may even attach to places or religious circumstances. Pliny infers from the belief that the priestess of the earth at Egira, when about to descend into the cave and predict, drinks without injury bull's blood, which is supposed to be a fatal poison. That like cures like, or more precisely, and paradoxically that the cause of the disease will cure its own result, is another notion which Pliny's medicine shares with magic. This is seen in the use of parts of the mad dog to cure its bite, or in rubbing thighs chafed by horseback, riding with the foam from a horse's mouth. The bite of the shrew mouse, too, is best healed by imposition of the very animal which bit you. But another shrew mouse will do, and they are kept ready in oil and mud for this purpose. The sting of the phalangium may be cured by merely looking at another insect of that species, whether it be dead or alive. From cases in which the cure for the disease is identical with its cause, it is, but a short step to remedies similar to or in some way associated with the ailment. It seems obvious to Pliny that stone in the bladder can be broken by the herb on which grow what look exactly like pearls. In the case of no other herb is it so evident for what medicine it is intended. Its species is such that it can be recognized at once by sight without book knowledge. Similarly, ophites, a marble with serpentine streaks, is used as an amulet against snake bite. Mithridates discovered that the blood of pontic ducks should be mixed in antidotes because they live on poison. Heliotrope seed looks like a scorpion's tail. If scorpions are touched with a sprig of heliotrope, they die, and they will not enter ground which has been circumscribed by it. To accelerate a woman's delivery, her lover should take off his belt and gird her with it, then untie it, saying that he has bound her and will unloose her, and then he should go away. An epileptic may be cured by driving an iron nail into the spot where his head rested when he fell in the fit. Other instances of association are when the remedy employed is some part of an animal who is free from the disease in question or marked by an opposite state of health. Goats and gazelles never have ophthalmia. Hence, various portions of their bodies are prescribed for eye diseases. Eagles can gaze at the sun. Therefore, their gall is efficacious in eye salves. The bird called ossifrage has a single intestine which digests anything. The end of this intestine serves as an amulet against colic, and indigestion may be cured by merely holding the crop of the bird in one hand. But do not hold it too long, or your flesh will waste away. The virus of Mares is an ingredient in a candle which makes heads of horses seem to appear when it burns, while ink of the sepia is used in a candle which causes Ethiopians to be seen when it is lighted. These magic candles are borrowed by Pliny from the works of Anaxilos, and we shall find them a feature of medieval collections of experiments. Earth from a cartwheel rut is thought a remedy against the bite of the shrew mouse because that creature is too torpid to cross such a rut, and Pliny believes that none of the virtues attributed to moles by the magicians is more probable than that they are an antidote to the bite of the shrew mouse, which shuns even ruts, whereas moles burrow freely through the soil. Pliny finds incredible the assertion made by some that a ship will move more slowly if it has the right foot of a tortoise aboard. But the logic of the magic seems evident enough. In Pliny's medicine, there are a number of examples of what may be called magic transfer, in which the aim of the procedure is not to cure the disease outright, but to rid the patient of it by transferring it from him to some other animal or object. Intestinal disease may be transferred to puppies who have not yet opened their eyes by pressing them to the body and giving them milk from the patient's mouth. They will die of the disease, when its cause and exact nature may be determined by dissecting them. But finally they must be buried. Griping pains in the bowels will also pass to a duct that is held against the abdomen. One may be rid of a cough by spitting in a frog's mouth, or cure catarrh by kissing a mule, although in these cases we are left uninformed whether the disease passes to the animal. But if a person who has been stung by a scorpion whispers the news in the ear of an ass, the ill will be transferred to the ass. A boil may be removed by rubbing 9 grains of barley around it, each grain thrice with the left hand, and then throwing them all into the fire. Warts are banished by touching each with a grain of the chickpea, and then tying the grains up in a linen cloth and throwing them behind one. If a root of asphodel is applied to sores and then hung up in smoke, the sores will dry up along with the root. To cure scrofulous, sores some bind on as many earthworms as there are sores and let them dry up together. A tooth will cease aching if the herb origerin is dug up with iron, and the patient thrice alternately touches the tooth with the root and spits, and if he then replaces the herb in the same spot, and it lives. If this last is a case of magic transfer, perhaps we may trace the same notion in some of the numerous instances in which Pliny directs that an animal shall be released alive after some part of it has been removed or some other medicinal use made of it. A common characteristic of magic force and occult virtue is that it will often act at a distance or without any physical contact or direct application. And there we may leave Pliny, surrounded by his scrolls and his secretaries, his remedies and his rites, his moles and his mistletoe, a man of extraordinary industry, a man of very selective skepticism, the man who preserved the ancient world for the Middle Ages, errors and all. Rest now. Good night, and thank you for listening to the Sleepy Archive.